Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce to you our first keynote speaker, distinguished professor of Rutgers University, Jan Kubik, with his lecture, Polarization, Democracy and War. Jan Kubik works on interplay between power, policies and culture, protest policies and social movements, and post-communist transformations. Professor, floor is yours.
Does it work? Yes. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. But first, I want to say that this is an incredibly moving and important thing for me. I'm very happy that I managed to come here. It is an honor, a privilege. I am pretty humbled by this invitation. I was asked to talk about my work, and in order to sort of try to move away from what's happening on the ground. So I guess those concepts that were introduced earlier of useless and useful knowledge, they have something to do with what I will try to do. I study the rise of right-wing populism the last several years around the world, particularly in Central Europe, but not only, and also a bit in my own country at the moment, United States. The phenomenon that is absolutely central to the politics these days is the phenomenon of polarization. So I started thinking about polarization also in the context of this visit and what it can mean. And you will see I'm trying to put together several thoughts on this very much, this triangle between polarization, democracy, and war. Well, the first question, of course, is what is polarization and why is it deemed to be detrimental to democracy? And then the question, which is equally interesting, are all forms or manifestations of polarization dangerous, particularly dangerous for democracy? So the literature is massive, and I have only 25 minutes, so types of polarization, people talk about political and ideological polarization, socio-economic polarization, which is a major problem in today's world, particularly in the United States, the rising inequality, ethical polarization, on which I will say a few words. I studied philosophy, luckily, I guess, in this context, in Krakow many years ago, so some of it and I did specialize a bit in ethics, so that comes handy. You never know. That's the point, right? You study various things, you never know what's going to be useful one day. And then affective or mass polarization, which is the polarization of the society, which is shown to be growing in many countries. So what is cultural polarization? My main professional identification is political or cultural anthropologist. Roughly, in essence, it is the claim that the social-political reality is binary. Often researchers use the word Manichaean. Manichaean religion, as some of you or more, all of you know, is the religion which emphasizes that the world is the eternal struggle between the forces of evil and the forces of good. And the opposite claim to binary Manichaean polarizing claim is a claim that emphasizes complexity, multilateralism, multiplicity, pluralism, moderation, nuance. Those are two options that are either in combat with each other, or there is an attempt to find some kind of middle ground. So, liberal democracy and ethical polarization. We are in the country that is experiencing the absolute horror of the Russian invasion. In liberal democracy, simply, we say that the key, most important virtue is moderation, compromise, leads to compromise. Democracy is about finding compromise. Even, you can say, democracy should, at least ideally, tolerate expressions of doubt. Whereas on the other hand, when you think about ethically about the situation here, you are definitely inclined, and it's completely understandable, of course, to be uncompromising in passing an ethical judgment. It is a Manichaean situation. This is a clash of the forces of evil and the forces of good. This is very natural to think like that. Well, the question then is, well, how to square those two things? One that is pushing towards compromise and the other that is pushing away from compromise because of the horror of the situation. So the tool I found, which I found many, many years ago already, is in the work of Yuri Lotman, who close to a semiotician, who close to the end of his life, wrote a little book, Kultura i Vzryw, Culture and Explosion, and it was translated into English. And the book is based on the very last few chapters, very simple premise that generally cultures, particularly political cultures, can be divided into two groups, binary and ternary. Binary cultures are those that dwell on polarization and actually constantly invoke it and use it. And as this is the quote from Lotman, in binary cultures, the change is explosive, violent, all-encompassing, revolutionary. The explosion penetrates life in its entirety, right? And of course, as you can see at the top, he thought that this was Russian culture. For long process of gestation, but eventually it is a culture that is binary. And the West, as he writes, is by and large ternary. That's the way he sets it up. In ternary systems, democracy is a ternary system. The essence is compromise, finding the middle. Polarization in one domain, say in ethics, does not necessarily spill over to other domains. That the change is limited to one domain, right? And when you think about what is one of the key features of democracy that we often do not talk enough sufficiently, is the idea of, in the most abstract terms, of functional differentiation. Every area of life, every domain of life, every profession, however we divide the society, to some degree, ideally at least, should be self-governing. This is where democracy thrives, if there is a plurality, the range of various subdomains of life which are at least partially autonomous and self-governing. Autonomy is the key word here. So the idea of the ternary system and the idea of ethics being limited to only one domain, its own ethical, is, you know, when you start thinking about it, somehow compatible with the democratic system. So those are the kind of theoretical, general preliminaries. Let's see what happens with all of this when we start pushing it further. So first thought, are all called polities, countries, political systems and their cultures binary or ternary, as Lotman was saying, Russia versus the West? Well, the answer is clearly no. I'm saying that after several years of studying the rise of right-wing populism, in all polities there's a competition between the people and political formations that on the one hand think in binary terms, and on the other those who think or are willing to accept ternary solutions, ternary ways of thinking. So let's call them binarists versus ternarists. The picture is the Polish roundtable, which was clearly an exercise in the ternary culture, and then on the other hand you have one of the demonstrators. I mean, the gesture, I guess, indicates that this is a binarist. That's actually the essential binary gesture, right? So, definition of liberal democracy. What am I talking about? We could spend several weeks here. I think the essence of democracy is relatively simple. It's the rule of majority, but electoral majority. I will not have time to explain that. This is not necessarily the sociological or cultural majority, but electoral majority those who voted a certain way, the rule of such electoral majority constrained by the rule of law. Now, if you are a sociologist, anthropologist, someone who wants to look beyond economic explanations, politological explanations alone, you will start thinking about what is the guarantee that the system will hold. Well, the answer is people need to believe in the rule of law, right? And in order for that, you need to have a sufficiently developed pro-democratic, pro-legal culture, particularly political culture, which takes a lot of time, very complex process. It's not easy to have. But we know quite a bit about that culture. Since Aristotle, we know that the principal value of the democratic culture is moderation, of the ternary culture, right? Moderation is the essence of ternarism. There's this book by Aurelian Craitiu, Faces of Moderation, very good review of all the various conceptions of moderation. Then the book that is pretty famous, How Democracies Die, if you look at it, read it, you discover that there's quite a strong cultural argument in the book. Namely, Levitsky and Ziblatt talk about two virtues of democracy: toleration and forbearance. Forbearance is self-restraint. You know you can play the game to the maximum and push the others from other political options, but you refrain for the bigger, more important good of the whole system. So you can easily kind of place the politicians on the range from being maximalists in the sense, and on the other end, those who are willing to compromise. Trump, at least rhetorically, is a good example of someone who constantly violates the rules of toleration and forbearance. So in essence, this leads to a culture that at its center needs to have the readiness for compromise and rejection of extremism. Now, what is right-wing populism? That is, again, in 1 minute or 2 minutes. The essence of populism is dual polarization. Populism in general, as an ideology, postulates that there are good people and bad elites. The picture is sociologically absolutely false, because the society is so complex, elites are complex, the selection of elites constantly changes, and so on. So the claim of this ideological position is good people versus bad elite. Now, the populist becomes right-wing when you add to the idea of good people the idea of bad people. They can be people of another race, another nation, another ethnicity, another religion. And you create, again, another binary picture. So now you have two binaries, vertical and horizontal, and this is not the only feature of right-wing populism, but very essential and necessary. So you see that if you start defining liberal democracy, you start defining right-wing populism, you get with a very opposite systems. We could, again, use this terminology, ternary versus binary. Why is it so important? For all kinds of reasons, but impact of polarization on democracy is devastating, particularly on democratic legitimacy. If you have a political culture that is strongly polarized, a unifying principle of legitimacy, which is the essence of for operating well-functioning democratic system, is impossible to establish and maintain. The case that I'm looking at now is my native Poland, which ended up with the completely split legitimacy. The representatives of the former ruling party are still in control of at least 4 major institutions, and both sides mutually accuse the other of not accepting the decisions and legitimacy of the other side. It's a kind of a stalemate that's been going on now for a year since the election a year ago. And now, I will not have time to talk about it, but the examples of the binary systems in geopolitics or international relations are several very well-known and absolutely central for the understanding of it. Some elements of the situation here is the idea of neo-Eurasianism, particularly developed by Dugin. I even spent some time reading his manual of geopolitics, 800 pages. I suppose some of you have looked at it. It's quite a read. Quite a, how should I call it? A bizarre adventure, but it's something there to take seriously. The relationship between those two guys, as you may know, is not very clear, but the structure of thinking is similar. Then there is Huntington with his famous Clash of Civilizations, which has been shown to be completely wrong-headed as a theoretical idea by many people, many researchers. Simply things do not work that way. I have no time to go through that. And then there is Mersheimer, some of you might have heard of it, of him, someone who represents the direction in foreign relations analysis called structural realism. He just presents the view that some of you may know it, just to refresh your memory, the system, international system is in the state of anarchy. There's some controlling body. So the only thing that matters is power. Power that really matters is superpower. So the only thing of interest for people who think like Mersheimer is usually the binary situation of the contest between two superpowers. The problem with this view is that this country, my country of origin, the Baltic states, all of them are gone. They disappear. We are not only chess bits on the chessboard played by superpowers, we are simply just a battleground. That's the kind of the view. So the view is thoroughly, right, through and through binary. So is Ukrainian, I asked myself this question. I know a few things, read this and that about Ukraine. Is Ukrainian political culture binary or ternary? Well, in the spirit of the major line of thinking I introduced earlier, it's the wrong question. In political cultures and public spheres of all countries, you have a competition between binarists and ternarists. That's the essence of politics these days around the world in many countries. So the right questions are, or some of them, what is the size of each side? What are the arguments of each side? How are they organized? Who wins? Temporalities. Nothing is permanent in the world of politics. And why? So I come across this book, very interesting, From Memory Wars to a Common Future, Overcoming Polarization in Ukraine. This is a beautiful, precise example of ternary thinking, of the ternary thought in this country, among others. So binary cultures, I'm slowly moving toward conclusions, are totalizing and thus consistent with authoritarian rule. And that's Russia. At the moment, ternary solutions in Russia are absolutely marginal, almost underground, right? In the 90s that I studied more carefully, years ago in Russia, it was a different situation. It was still a possible contest, right? Ukraine has been historically subjected to tremendous pressures due to the clash between the two principles, binary coming from Moscow and ternary coming from the West. Many, many people wrote about it. But it is ternary side which is way stronger in Russia, right? And people I know also personally whose work I know, but there are many others, Yaroslav Hrycak, Tim Snyder, or Mykola Ryabchuk. They all talk about it in various ways, many others also. So if a polity, not just Ukraine, has a sufficiently strong ternary political culture and a system of ternary political institutions, this polity also has mechanisms that protect the system. This is sort of a bit, maybe too excessively abstract language, protect the system from the spillover of a binary vision from one domain to another. In other words, if you have a ternary system relatively well established, you can allow yourself to be binarist here and there, for example, in ethics. Some of the material for this thought came from the project I was initially associated with, then I had to move on to other duties, the 3 Ukrainian revolutions. Evidence of the very strong ternary culture. In essence, we know all of this better than I do, self-corrective mechanisms of the defective process of democratization, very few people have a doubt. But, on the other hand, anybody who studies democratization around the world, the history of democratization, has no doubt that the process is always defective. It has never worked without reversals, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, in every country, including the principal suspects of easy, maybe some people think, democratization, like the United Kingdom. So you have the defective process of democratization with self-corrective mechanism, and the goal of the 3 revolution was the return to the process of democratization to its path. It was not. It would be almost impossible to find evidence, if any, that it was a total upheaval against the idea of democratization. And then the last, I think, slide in a way of conclusion. Thinking in binary terms, evil versus good, is inescapable during the war. Does it endanger democracy? This was actually a question that was once posed to me. Binary ethical thinking is hard to avoid in the face of aggression, and it is effective for mobilization. I've studied social movements for about 30 years, at least, maybe more, and it is the binary frame is a very effective tool for mobilizing people against whatever they define, whoever they define as the enemy. But binary ethical thinking, ethical maximalism, practiced in a ternary system does not threaten the whole system with polarization. It does so in binary systems, which, is famously described for Russia, for example, constitute single pyramids of power. I am very strongly convinced that this is not at all the situation in this country, and actually participating and thinking a lot about Russian revolutions and this enormous resilience and strength and courage shown by the people of this country is incredibly uplifting. So I am very, again, thankful for being here and for being allowed to share a few thoughts with you. Hope some of it is useful. I will be very happy to answer questions. Slava Ukraini.